Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Bob Pigott. Bob Pigott is a lawyer and an historian and someone who loves to walk the streets of our terrific city. Bob Pigott has written an amazing book entitled New York's Legal Landmarks, in which he presents photographs and drawings of palaces of justice, past and present. Bob, we are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Now tell us about this book. It might strike some as a little weird that somebody walks the streets and takes on an interest in court buildings all over the city.
I've lived in New York City all my life, and I've been a lawyer for half of my lifetime, and I love to walk the streets, very interested in New York City history. And I can remember the precise moment when I got the idea for writing this book.
An epiphany, a light bulb went off in your head.
That's exactly what it was. I was exploring a part of New York I didn't know very well, the Sunset Park neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I was walking along 42nd Street towards 4th Avenue, towards the river, and I came upon this really spectacular, majestic building. There was a sign over one of the doors that said Community Board 7, but if you looked more closely, you could see one sign that said Magistrates Court and another sign that said Municipal Court. And I'd been practicing law for over 25 years, and I'd never heard of either of these courts. And it really,
I'm a little older. I've heard of both.
Well, I've spent a fair amount of time looking at them now, but I was just so struck by the fact that you had this really striking building in a very remote part of Brooklyn. It got me very interested. I started researching these old courthouses, and I realized that there was enough there to write a book, I thought, because there's so many lawyers in New York City, and I thought this would be of interest to lawyers and to those interested in New York City history generally.
Yes, well, indeed it is. Now, you start, of course, with our Dutch past. We were in New Amsterdam. One thinks of Peter Stuyvesant, Peter Minuet. So let's start with your first Dutch building, the Stadhuis.
I think that's the way to say it. Stadhuis, I think that's it.
The way to say it, the State House. Well, tell us about that.
Well, that was the first building in New York City that functioned as a courthouse at all. It was at the very tip of Manhattan, the southern tip of Manhattan. And it was built in 1653, and I'm aware of one event of legal significance, historical significance that happened there, and it was really an event that laid the groundwork for our freedom of religion in this country. There was a group of English Quakers way out in Flushing, Queens, and their right to practice their religion was being suppressed by Governor Stuyvesant. He hailed them into the Stadhuis, eventually shipped them back off to the Netherlands, where actually their convictions were reversed and their rights were vindicated. So their document, the Flushing Remonstrance, is one of the founding documents in this country in terms of the roots of the freedom of worship, and that happened in this building, the Stadhuis, at the very southern tip of Manhattan. It existed until the 1690s, when it was replaced by another city hall. By this time, New York was an English colony, and it was replaced by a building in which a number of very significant historical events happened.
Well, tell us about that building.
Well, that building, if you go to Wall Street, just catty corner from the New York Stock Exchange, you will see a building with columns and steps and a statue of George Washington. And a lot of people see the statue of Washington and think that that's where he was sworn in during that one-year period when New York City was the nation's first capital. Actually, it was the building that stood on that site before the construction of the building that you see today, the old City Hall, the building that was the City Hall for New York City throughout the 18th century. That is the building I'm talking about. And in terms of legal events of significance that happened in that building, one event, if you remember from American history, the trial of John Peter Zenger, a printer who was
Sure do.
Who was
that was freedom of the press.
Exactly.
So we go from freedom of religion to freedom of the press. We're writing the Constitution on the streets of New York.
You can all do it on Broad Street right there. He was prosecuted for seditious libel, and to defend him, they brought in a lawyer named Andrew Hamilton from Philadelphia. I guess the New York bar wasn't what it is today, and they had to reach out to Philadelphia to find a lawyer for him. And he was ultimately acquitted. And that holding, again, laid the groundwork for one of the key elements of our Bill of Rights. And significantly, it was 65 years later that in that very building, the Bill of Rights was adopted by Congress. As I said, during that 1 year when New York City was the capital of the United States.
Wow. So now it's the Sub-Treasury building? Or
It's the Sub-Treasury building, right? And it's also called Federal Hall. But in the 19th century, that's where they stored a ton of gold. But now it's Federal Hall, and there are exhibits there. There was a famous trial in that building, which is kind of interesting because, you know, we all remember the Dream Team from the O.J. Simpson trial. This trial in 1800 featured America's first Dream Team. It was a murder trial. A fellow named Levi Weeks was accused of having murdered a fellow boarder in his lodging house, having thrown her down a well. And somehow he was able to assemble as his defense team Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr.
They didn't have a duel in the courtroom, did they?
No, this was 4 years before their famous duel. They collaborated with a third lawyer, Brock Holst Livingston, and after what for the time was a very long trial, 3 days, they managed to get Mr. Weeks acquitted. But it's funny to think that just 4 years later, they met on the plains of Weehawken in New Jersey with their dueling pistols, and I like to think of it as a cautionary tale when you're choosing your co-counsel in a case.
Got to be very careful.
Yep.
He could be the death of you.
Exactly.
Now, you then picture the Royal Exchange building. Now, we're still in this Dutch period, aren't we?
Well, now we're in the late 18th century. This is really significant in that 1 year period that New York City was the capital of the United States, because in this building, it was at the foot of Broad Street, right opposite where Francis Tavern stands today. This building, the Royal Exchange building, or the Merchants Exchange building as it was also called, this was the first home of the United States Supreme Court. This is where they first met. They had 2 sessions in that brief period in late 1789, early 1790. They didn't really hear any cases. I think they just admitted several lawyers to their bar. But if you want to know where the Supreme Court first sat, again, it's right on Broad Street. Right
on Broad Street. Now, of course, politicians have to get into the act. And our next image is of the Tweed Courthouse, which stands today. Tweed was named after old Tammany Hall's boss, Tweed.
That's right, William Marcy Tweed. And this
corrupt as hell.
Corrupt as hell. This building, even though I think it's a wonderful building, there was a lot of very negative associations with it because of the way in which it was built. Boss Tweed had it built it was originally budgeted at $1 million. We're talking 1870 now, it came in at over $12 million. And it's...
Who got the rest?
Well, that's what...
a little tin box, that's what...
A little tin box. Boss Tweed and his cronies pocketed a huge amount of money, but ironically, poetic justice, I guess, he was eventually tried in an unfinished courtroom in the Tweed Courthouse.
And tried in his own courthouse?
Yep.
So we got the thing named after him, and then he was tried there for what? Corruption?
That's right. And he went to jail.
Went to jail.
He died in jail. But, you know, unfortunately, that building, it was the New York County Courthouse for a number of years. But there were, as I said, there were a lot of negative associations with it, and there were movements to tear it down as early as 1900, as recently as the 1970s under the Mayor Beam administration. Then there was talk of turning it into the Museum of the City of New York. That never happened, and ultimately, Mayor Bloomberg housed the New York City Department of Education there, and there's even actually a middle school there. You can see kids playing touch football on the lawn.
So Tweed continued to rule from the grave.
Exactly.
Now, we move on to what was the old Hall of Records, now the Surrogates Court, which is a magnificent landmark building within the Civic Center, and we have cases involving the estates of dead people that are tried there to this day. We have that image. So tell us about the Surrogates Court with its marvelous interiors and its ornate design.
Well, the construction of this building was really an expression of the City Beautiful movement that took hold in the 1890s, originating in the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And this building was built as one of the first buildings of what was planned to be a large civic center and spilled over into what became Foley Square, just a couple of blocks uptown. It's really a building every New Yorker should go inside because you feel like you're stepping into the Paris Opera House.
So now we move on to a building that many are still familiar with. It's the first place it's pictured all the time on television. It's our state Supreme Court building in Foley Square.
Right. That building was built to replace the Tweed Courthouse. In 1914, the city held a competition to design a new state courthouse for New York County, and a Boston architect named Guy Lowell won the competition and designed this enormous circular building that was never built. What with the intervention of World War I and budget overruns, ultimately the design was scaled back to the present design that you see at 60 Center Street. And I know you've spent a lot of time in that building. I've spent a lot of time in it too. My wife actually is in the middle of a 4-month trial. She's a juror, and she's spending 4 months in this building.
And she doesn't discuss the case with you?
She does not discuss the case with me.
Well, a good woman is hard to find. But the inside, you have these marvelous rotundas. Who designed all that? Do you know?
Well, the murals in the rotunda, that was a WPA project
Yes.
during the 1930s. And when the building was first built, it had some amenities it doesn't have today. There was on the 7th floor a dining room for the judges.
Certainly has no amenities today.
Not very many amenities, but it really is a wonderful building, and it really is iconic. Those steps have appeared in so many movies. The last scene in 12 Angry Men when Henry Fonda says goodbye to his fellow juror, and then more fanciful trials like the one in Miracle on 34th Street that happened in that building.
Santa Claus.
Exactly. And of course, Sam Waterston and his ADAs are often seen exiting from that building. Although the producers of Law and Order play a little fast and loose jurisdictionally because those criminal lawyers are often exiting from rooms in the Surrogates Court, which, as you mentioned, is only for trust and estates cases.
Yes. Well, then we just go across the street in Foley Square to a courthouse that houses what lawyers call the Mother Court, the Southern District of New York, 2 weeks older than the United States Supreme Court. So tell us about that.
That's right, and it also first met in that building that we discussed earlier, the Royal Exchange Building, or the Merchants Exchange Building. James Duane, a New Yorker, was appointed the first district judge for what was then the District of New York. There was no Southern District of New York yet. That wouldn't come into existence until 1814 when the state was divided into the Northern District of New York and the Southern District.
Now, Duane had been the mayor of the city of New York, had he not? He'd been a member of the First Continental Congress and great pal of George Washington, and then he had a street named after him, which is right next to the courthouse, Duane Street. Even had a drugstore named after him.
That's right. The very first Duane Reade was between Duane Street and Reade Street. So every time I go into a Duane Reade, of course I think of the Mother Court now.
Now, I thought that the only federal judge in history who had, from the Southern District, who had a street named after him was James Duane. As far as you know, isn't that right?
No, I think there's some others in New York. There's a Gustav Hartmann Square named for a municipal court judge.
No, but a federal judge.
Oh, federal judge. Federal judge. That may be right.
May be right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, Richard Varick succeeded Duane as mayor, but he was not a federal judge. He had Varick Street named after him. And he was Dutch. Okay, so then we moved from the federal courthouse to the old city hall.
Right. Now, the thing to remember is that, the Southern District, the federal courts back then were not what they are today. The jurisdiction was much more limited, a lot of admiralty. They just didn't have the significance place that they have in jurisprudence today. And when you look at some of these locations of the federal courts in New York City, they're very unimpressive. Often, the federal courts are just a tenant. After the building we just looked at, the Royal Exchange Building, the Mother Court, the Southern District, was in the old City Hall, that building where the Zenger and the Weeks trial happened. Then it moved to the current City Hall, which was built in 1811, and it was there for a number of years. Then it was in the old Almshouse for a while. It was in some leased space west of Broadway. It was even in a theater for a while.
Burton's Theater.
Burton's Theater, that's exactly right. Originally Palmo's Opera House, transformed into Burton's Theater, and ultimately the home of the Southern District of New York before the construction of the first federal building that was home for the Southern District, which is a building that doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, now in the early 1900s, two legendary federal judges were appointed to the bench, Learned Hand and his cousin Augustus Hand. And Learned Hand had his chambers, actually, in another building. What building was that?
That was the Woolworth Building. It's sort of a funny thing when you think today of the digs of federal judges and how grand they are with private elevators whisking them from their chambers to their courtrooms. Poor Learned Hand, whom many people think is the greatest federal judge not to have been named to the Supreme Court, Poor Learned Hand had his courtroom in that post office building at the southern tip of Broadway, and he had his chambers across the street in the Woolworth Building, so he had to dodge traffic as he made his way back and forth between chambers and courtroom.
That wonderful Art Deco building, and now, and then the court eventually moved to another WPA building, a Cass Gilbert building, which is in Foley Square and which has recently been renovated, while the court now has its headquarters, at least in Manhattan, over on Pearl Street. Isn't that right?
That's right. In 1936, the United States Courthouse was built at 40 Center Street, as you said, a Cass Gilbert building. He was also the designer of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and also the Woolworth Building, where we just observed Judge Hand had his chambers. And that building was originally the home for the district judges, the Second Circuit, the U.S. Attorney's Office. I don't know if they were still there by the time you were in that office.
They certainly were. And my office was on the 4th floor of the Foley Square Courthouse.
So I guess they moved to St. Andrew's Place sometime after.
Sometime
after
later.
that.
Ill-advised move. It was wonderful in Foley Square. But now another absolute architectural gem is the Appellate Division on Madison Avenue in the 20s.
That's right.
Tell us about that building.
Well, that building was built in 1900, and it really has some incredible sculpture on the exterior. You know, the Appellate Division was only created by the Constitution of 1894 and came into existence in 1896.
New York State Constitution.
New York State Constitution, yes. And for the first 4 years or so, the Appellate Division rented space on Fifth Avenue, but then this jewel of a courtroom was built right on the corner of 25th Street and Madison Avenue, and it exists to this day. And it's got this wonderful courtroom with a rotunda with stained glass windows. It's got a cloakroom, which unfortunately they don't use anymore. If you go into the lobby area, it really looks unchanged from the way it looked 100 years ago. The same settee is there. I've seen photographs that show Oriental rugs in that lobby. They're not there anymore, but I guess they've been replaced by the magnetometers you find now. But it really is a wonderful building. Again, it's a building any New Yorker can walk right into and take a look at. But as beloved as it was, there was actually talk of moving the court out of that building in the 1930s. The city actually acquired some space on Park Avenue and 39th Street and was planning to build a new Appellate Division courthouse there. Ultimately, it never happened, thankfully, I think, and we still have that lovely courthouse on Madison Avenue and 25th Street.
Now, we can't leave out the Harlem Courthouse at 121st and 3rd. Now, is that still operating as a courthouse? It
is still operating. It was built in the 1870s at a time when Harlem was really virtually a suburb. The subways did not go up to Harlem in the 1870s, and it has sort of the feel of a country courthouse. It's on 121st Street, just off 3rd Avenue. It was a police court, then a magistrate's court, and then for many years its judicial function was dormant. But it was revived more recently. It's a housing court. It's a small claims court. It has the more user-friendly name now, the Harlem Community Justice Center. But again, that's another building that can be visited by any New Yorker, and it's a very impressive building. All these buildings were intended to convey the majesty of the law, but interestingly,
trappings of justice.
But interestingly, a lot of these neighborhood courthouses were not very impressive. There was one, for example, that was in rented space in a movie theater, and litigants and lawyers actually had to troop through the movie theater lobby and go up to the 2nd floor to the courtroom. But some of them were very grand, and the Harlem Courthouse is certainly an example of that, and I'm very glad it's still standing.
So you started with Brooklyn, and I suppose there's some justice in finishing with the Bronx. Mm-hmm. Tell us about the Bronx County Courthouse.
Well, this actually was called the Bronx Borough Courthouse because it's so old, it predates Bronx County, which only came into existence in the early 20th century. It's a building on 162nd Street and 3rd Avenue. When it was built, there was an elevated train rumbling up 3rd Avenue in the Bronx, and it really is a spectacular building. It's still standing. Sadly, there's a lot of graffiti on the exterior. It's been vacant for a number of years. The interior's been gutted. It was described by the New York Times writer Christopher Gray as one vast pigeon coop. But hopefully, some use will be made of it. And it's been landmarked, so at least the exterior is safe, and hopefully some worthwhile use will be made of this building, because it really is a lovely building.
Could be a museum.
That would be, it's not a very central location. It's 161st.
Well, neither is the Bronx Zoo.
Neither is the Bronx Zoo, and they do get people to go up to the Bronx Zoo, so maybe there's some hope for that idea.
You think there's some hope. Now, of all of these wonderful buildings that you've explored in your travels, and I know we've left out probably half of them, which are your favorites?
I think I love the Surrogates Court. I love the Appellate Division. The Jefferson Market Library. It's now a library. However, it was built as a police court. It's in Greenwich Village. And interestingly, Henry K. Thaw was arraigned there, the man who...
Harry K. Thaw.
Right, Harry Thaw.
He was the one who murdered Stanford White, the architect.
That's right, for dallying
with his wife.
That's exactly right.
It's very dangerous to dally with somebody else's wife.
So he was arraigned there, and that building was a courthouse. And then in the 1950s, there was actually talk of tearing it down, and this was before the enactment of the landmark preservation laws. But thankfully, there was a grassroots preservation movement. They got the ear of then Mayor Wagner, who prevailed upon the New York Public Library to take it on as a library. So now it functions as a library, but that's definitely worth a visit.
Any others?
Oh, there's so many others. There's a building out in Flushing, which now is the Flushing Council on the Arts, but it was the Flushing Town Hall. It's on...
You didn't want to miss Queens.
No, I'm a Queens boy.
Yeah.
So
it's a long walk to Queens.
Well, if you drive out Northern Boulevard just past Shea Stadium, you come to this building, and when I go there, just the thought that in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt gave a campaign speech on the steps of this building, those are the kinds of things that really energized me and got me very excited about this project.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt was one of our great police commissioners.
That's right. He's the only person born in New York City to become President of the United States. And in fact, the current courthouse for the Eastern District of New York in downtown Brooklyn was named for him, which is a little surprising because you don't really associate him with either the judiciary or with Brooklyn. But this spectacular modern courthouse that's been built in downtown Brooklyn is the Theodore Roosevelt Courthouse.
Theodore Roosevelt Courthouse. And of course he's associated with the Museum of Natural History as well. I think he's astride a horse in front of the museum.
Right. He had a hobby which I don't know if his college roommates appreciated. He was an avid taxidermist.
Yes, he was a taxidermist. I don't know that they appreciated it either.
And some of these other buildings have been renamed. 40 Center Street has been renamed for Thurgood Marshall, who was on the Second Circuit in that building.
That's the old Foley Square Federal Courthouse. Yes, he was on the Second Circuit before he went to the Supreme Court. And then, of course, the successor courthouse is called the Daniel Moynihan Courthouse, after Senator Moynihan, who was a great supporter of the Southern District.
But you know, when I sort of completed my tour of the courthouses, I got to thinking that there are a lot of other locations in New York City of legal significance. And I started researching them and included them in my book as well. So for example, so many famous New Yorkers, right now, the United States Supreme Court, 4 of the justices grew up in New York City. So for example, where did the 4 of them go to high school? That's the sort of thing I researched and put in my book. Or where did Judge Crater disappear? Where did the famous Paulsgraph accident happen in Brooklyn?
Were you able to find Judge Crater?
Never found Judge Crater.
So now the Supreme Court justices, let's see, the ones that grew up in New York. Scalia was born in New Jersey, but he grew up in New York.
Elmhurst.
Elmhurst, Queens.
And he went to Xavier High School on 16th Street.
Xavier High School. Then you have Sotomayor, certainly grew up in New York.
She was from the Bronx. And she
Ginsburg grew up in Brooklyn.
Right, Flatbush, Brooklyn, James Madison High School.
Okay, and who's the last one?
Justice Kagan went to Hunter.
Right. Oh, before she moved to the west side of Manhattan.
Well, she was living on the west side of Manhattan on West End Avenue, and she went to Hunter, which at the time, interestingly, was not on the Upper East Side. It was in an office building on Lexington Avenue.
On Lexington Avenue. So now what are you doing to market your book and to let people know about it? It's so terrific. It's so marvelous. It should be in every New Yorker's library. You must be going around talking. And where are you talking?
I'm giving a lot of talks. It's one thing that I really appreciate is that this book has given me an opportunity to interact with judges in a way I wouldn't normally have. I've spoken to a group of judges in the Southern District, in the Eastern District, And they're the City Bar, the County Lawyers Association. There are just a lot of different groups that have shown enthusiasm for my book. So it's been really very satisfying.
Well, your enthusiasm is contagious, and I certainly want to thank you for coming by, Bob. This has been wonderful. It's just a wonderful trip down memory lane, or even where the memory of man runneth not. And it's really been fabulous having you on the program. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I am Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. All the best.